Hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. If you do like the programming you see here, the musicians and artists I visit with, please be sure and hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel. Jonathan King is an English record producer, singer-songwriter, music entrepreneur, and TV presenter. Jonathan first came to the music public's attention in 1965 with his song Everyone's Gone to the Moon. In 1967, he discovered the rock band Genesis and produced their first album, From Genesis to Revelation. Mr. King would also start up his own label, UK Records, in 1972. On the roster were the bands 10cc and Bay City Rollers. During the years 1971 and 72, he produced 6 top 30 singles in the UK under various pseudonyms. During the 80s, he made appearances on radio and TV, including Top of the Pops and Entertainment USA. In 1990 and 91, Jonathan produced the Brit Awards, and in 1997, he chose and produced the winning British entry for the Eurovision Song Contest, Katrina and the Waves' Love Shine a Light. Today, my guest is still going strong at 80 years old. Well, welcome, Jonathan.
Welcome, nice to be here.
Thank you for taking time out to visit. Well, take us back to the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Britain, in London, within the sound of Bow Bells, which makes me technically a Cockney, of an American father who came to England when he was a teenager and went to British public school. But the result is I'm technically half American and half British. My father was from New York originally, and he married my mother, who was a quite successful actress. And then after a few years of marriage, she gave up acting to become a mother. And the first child she produced was this stunningly handsome young man you see in front of you at this very moment.
If you do say so yourself, right?
No. I don't say myself. You just heard that. It came from the ether. It wasn't actually me speaking.
It wasn't actually from you. Okay. Well, you recall your childhood growing up? Was it pretty fond memories?
Yes, a very happy childhood. I went to Charterhouse Public School, which is what we call a private school, or what you call a private school. For no good reason, we call it a public school. I've never worked out why. And I had a good time there and enjoyed myself. Then I went on, I passed into Trinity College, Cambridge University to study Master of Arts and English Literature, which I did. Before going up to Cambridge, I went round the world because I had 9 months of my life before ending school and before starting university. And during that time, I was completely by then addicted to pop music. I absolutely idolized Buddy Holly, Roy Orbison, Gene Pitney, and those great artists of the middle 60s. I loved them all. I was only a teenage fan, but I was determined that I was going to be the next big thing. Unfortunately, what happened was the next big thing occurred by this stupid band called the Beatles, who stole my glory. I mean, I was all prepared to take over the world, and these cunts turned up with their silly hair called the Beatles. So while I was going around the world, my mum, who was just brilliant, sent to each Thomas Cook's in each city the latest copy of the New Musical Express, which was a music paper of that time, so I could keep up to speed with what was going on in the pop world, although I clearly wasn't making even a dent in it. And when I saved up I had no money at all. I had £1 a day that my mother had given me for this 9-month trip. That £1 a day, which in those days was about $2 a day. These days is not quite worth so much. That had to cope with my board and lodging, my travel around each city I went to, my hotel, and my food and everything else. £1 a day, can you believe?
You had to eat to get by, yes.
Right, and I was given this round the world ticket.
We're,
So it went, I
we're,
started off, I skipped Europe because I knew I was going to go to Europe a lot anyway, and I'd already been there. I think I started actually in Athens, which is partly in Europe, and then went on all the way around the world. And I was saving up a little bit of money each day so that when I got to Australia, I could afford to stay in a five-star hotel just for one night. The
um,
reason for that was I wanted to stay in the Southern Cross Hotel in Melbourne because I knew on that night the Beatles were touring Australia and were staying in that hotel. But
yes.
I wasn't interested in the Beatles. I wanted to meet this man called Brian Epstein.
Yes, yes.
Brian Epstein was their manager, and I thought clearly there's been this horrible mistake in humanity, and the Beatles have emerged instead of me. The only man who can put this right must be Brian.
Yes.
So I get to Melbourne, I check into the Southern Cross Hotel, which already by then was surrounded by 8 million Australian teenage girls going, John, I love you. Paul, you're gorgeous. George, you're fantastic. Ringo, you can have sex with me. And I went into the hotel, checked in, got into my room, picked up the phone, as one does in those days, and said to the operator, can you please connect me with Brian Epstein? To which the operator replied, oh, I'm sorry, he's checked out, but I'll put you through to his assistant. And put me through to his room, which was a man called Derek Taylor, who became one of my dearest friends. Derek Taylor was at the time the publicist for the Beatles. And I said to him, oh, hello, I'm sorry to bother you. I was hoping to meet Brian Epstein because I want to be the next big thing and I'm going around the world and all that. Derek Taylor was so wonderful. He said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. Brian isn't here at the moment. He's gone off on holiday to Hawaii. Are you planning to go to Hawaii?
Right,
And I
right.
said, well, yes, my next stop is New Zealand. And after that, it's Fiji. And then it's Hawaii. And I was planning to spend 4 or 5 days in each. But actually, if he's in Hawaii, I'll only spend a day in each and go straight on to Hawaii. So Derek said, well, I suggest that's what you do. This is his hotel name. This is his room number. Tell him you've spoken to me. And so off I went. Well, you imagine in this day and age, I'd probably been arrested by police and thrown in prison for 100 years. But in those days, I spent through New Zealand very unfairly on New Zealand. I spent about 5 minutes in Auckland and 10 minutes in Wellington,
Oh
then
no.
then shot off to Fiji, where I spent about 10 minutes again, and then to Hawaii. Got to Hawaii, checked into the YMCA because that was the most I could afford in those days. That was at least 50 pence or 75 cents a night. Went straight to the Thomas Cook office to collect my New Musical Express that my mum had sent me, and then went to the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, where I've stayed ever since, the Pink Palace, they called it, on Waikiki Beach, and went to the front desk and said, can I speak to Mr. Brian Epstein, please? And they said, oh, he's not in his room, he's down by the pool. And it's that way. So I went that way. And there by the pool was Brian sitting on his deck chair, getting a suntan, looking very bored. And I went up to him and said, oh, I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Epstein, but, my name is Kenny King, as it then was. And he said, oh, is that the New Musical Express you've got? And I said, yes. He said, oh my God, is that this week's? And I said, yes. He said, would you mind awfully if I read it? I've been so bored here and it would be brilliant. And I said, no, by all means. And he read it from cover to cover. And we became dear friends from that moment on.
Yes.
And he introduced me, gave me introductions to Dick James, the publisher in
Oh,
New
the publisher.
London,
Yes.
and a guy called Tommy Lipuma, who was a producer in Los Angeles who he really liked. And he said, these people will give you advice and they'll help you and all that, which was terribly sweet of him. And it
Yeah.
went, things went from there. I then,
Well,
it didn't,
that was
it, that,
fortunate. I was
yes,
going to say that was fortunate you had that copy of NME, with you.
it was indeed. I mean, I think he was a really nice guy. And as I said, we became incredibly close friends.
Yes. Very interesting. Very interesting. Also, earlier on, maybe going back a little bit, you were really into musicals, weren't you?
Yes, when I was really young,
Yeah.
I lived in Surrey at my mum's house, and I used to save up my pocket money, walk to the nearest station, take the train up to London. This was age 12, 11 or 12, go to a theatre, buy a ticket right up in what they call the gods, the very top row, and see musicals such as The King and I, appropriately named. And I still
Yeah.
think the song Something Wonderful was probably written about me.
About
Anybody
you.
who
Yeah.
knows, yes. And my favorite, which was Kismet, which I loved, but all the other ones, Oklahoma and all the great musicals, most of which were American, I have to say, although there were British ones like Salad Days and so on, and I loved them. I thought they were all magic. But my main interest in music was much more pop, and
Yeah.
I would say probably Buddy Holly was the number one. I mean,
Yeah.
I had glasses, and nobody in pop or in music had glasses in those days, so that was a start. B, he and Pitney and Orbison and so on also had those very high voices, and of course I was just a child. My voice hadn't even broken by then, so I was able to sing in that sort of a way. But yes, the musicals and
Yeah.
music generally were a huge influence of me in the late 50s and then early 60s.
Yes. Well, speaking of Buddy Holly, you had a real affinity for the song "It Doesn't Matter Anymore."
Oh, I have indeed.
Yes.
That was probably my favorite ever song in the early days.
Yeah. Written by
And
Paul Anka. That was written by Paul Anka. I
yes, I know.
yeah.
Although of course Buddy also wrote some great songs himself. And later on, when I started running record companies, which I did, like run Decca for a while and so on, I did get to meet Norman Petty, for example, and some of the other people around. Although, of course, sadly, I never met Buddy because
Yeah.
he took a rather unpleasant flight, which
Yeah.
decided to land in an unpleasant place.
Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, yes. That song, "It Doesn't Matter Anymore," you would make a demo of that and approach John Schroeder at Oriole Records.
I did indeed, and he signed me up to do a session, but really didn't work and never went anywhere. Although, funnily enough, I remained friendly with John for many years and had lunch with him long after he left the music industry. He was actually a very potent, strong force in the music industry, but really wasn't in any way involved in my career, which really didn't go anywhere despite people like Johnny Schroeder, who at the time was really big with artists like Helen Shapiro and so on. He was a
Yeah.
songwriter as well as a producer and a record executive with, believe it or not, a company called Oriole Records in London at the time, who distributed a small American company called CBS, or I
Yeah.
think it was then CBS before it became Sony in Great Britain. And I think he even distributed another small label called Tamla Motown. So he was way ahead of his time, John, but my sessions with him never actually really went anywhere.
Your first band, or one of your first band, the Bumbleys.
And the Bumblies, yes, the good old Bumblies. Well, I was technically their manager, but actually I did a sort of guest spot where I sang three or four numbers.
Uh-huh.
And I produced them. And the lead singer was actually a guy called Terry Ward, who only died recently. And I produced them doing one of my songs, which was actually a crap song, listen to it today, called Gotta Tell.
Don't it tell.
And I tried to place it with record companies and nobody was the slightest bit interested until I reached a label called Fontana and an A&R man called Jack Baverstock, who happened to have another guy in his office called Don Moss, who was one of the top DJs at the time in London. And again, both of them were terribly nice and enthusiastic. I think they saw something in me rather than the sound of the record, but they still agreed to put it out. So technically, that was my first release, although I'd only written and produced it. I didn't sing on it.
Yes, yes. Well, another track, "All You've Got to Do," was recorded with Joe Meek.
It was indeed the mighty Joe Meek, one of my great heroes, one of the great record producers.
Yes,
Joe Meek and Phil Spector, who, by the
yes.
way, hated each other because
Did they?
Joe thought Phil had stolen a lot of his ideas.
Uh,
And one of the great joys of my life is I did manage to get to meet both of them. Both of them were very sweet, charming human beings. I never had any problem with either of them. Joe Meek never tried to lay his hand on my knee. I was rather disappointed, actually. Uh, and Phil Spector likewise never decided to shoot me. In fact, he took me to a basketball game and dinner with a friend of his called Wilt Chamberlain, who was quite a
oh,
well-known
yes,
basketball player. And
yes,
I'll always remember when Wilt Chamberlain shook my hand, his hand went right up to my elbow when he shook it. I
yes.
then had I had two experiences. One was at the basketball match. I understood nothing about basketball. So Phil put one earphone into my ear in which the commentary was going on. In the other, he was shouting what the rules were and everything. And it was like some sort of experience, out of body experience. And
I bet.
we then went and have dinner with Wilt after the game. And again, that was quite surreal. The whole thing was very surreal and thoroughly enjoyable. And I have to say, I have nothing but positive memories of Phil Spector, including after everything happened to him. I wrote to him in prison and he wrote back to me several times.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, Wilt Chamberlain is so tall too.
Indeed,
I know
indeed.
he had to duck every door to go through. He probably had to duck down to get through the doorway, or
Yeah,
get
and
into cars.
well,
Yeah,
and
getting into cars. Yeah, yeah,
I'm quite tall. I'm about 6'2", 6'1", 6'2".
yeah.
Although I'm now shrinking now that I'm getting old.
Yes, that's what happens. I'm 6'2", but I noticed that as you get a little bit older, you start shrinking. Yeah. Well, how did you come into contact with Zombies producers Kim Jones and Joe Roncaroni?
Well, that was how I broke through, and it was all thanks to somebody called Tony Hall. Tony Hall was a disc jockey, and he was also head of promotion at Decca Records. And he was one of many people who I wrote from my sick bed at Trinity College, Cambridge, because I developed something that was similar to an ulcer. It wasn't actually an ulcer, but it was that kind of thing. And I was in bed. Those days, the only treatment was stay in bed, let it heal itself, only drink milk and eat mashed foods like mashed fish and mashed eggs, and slowly it would heal, which indeed it did. But it meant spending 2 months in bed, which I did in the hospital room at Trinity College, Cambridge. Well, I did all my work for the college, which mainly, of course, involved reading books. That's why I enjoyed it so much. I mean, how could anybody say this is a course when you've got to read 50 books? Well, I read
Yeah.
all the books by Dickens and Shakespeare and every great writer you could imagine. Jonathan Swift was one of my great favorites. He's the one I got my name from eventually. And all of these people, I read all the books in about a week completely. I'm lying in bed, I've got nothing to do. So I'm awake for 18 hours a day. And I'm a fast reader anyway. I read all the books, I wrote all the essays, I've done everything. And I'm lying there going, I've got to become the world's biggest pop star. So I was writing to everybody saying, please help. And the only one who replied was Tony Hall. And he said, look, do pop in and see me when you got better. Come into my office in Great Marlborough Street, where I'm running Decca Records, and visit me, which I then did. wonderful, wonderful, positive man. There were three people who he believed in. We were all at school. We were all teenagers, and it was me, Kenneth King, as I then was, and two other young people who were the same age as me, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber. And the three of us would go round to see Tony probably once a week, and he would give us advice. And his advice was brilliant. Anyway, on his advice, I then wrote some more songs and recorded them with the Bumbleys, doing the backing and all this. They were all crap, by the way. And eventually, one of them he listened to. He listened to all these tracks. I mean, I can't believe this man, how kind he was, you know? And I've tried to do this for all my career. I've tried to listen to people and help people and everything else. And I'm absolutely sure Genesis would never have happened. A, they would never have been called Genesis. My name, the reason I called them Genesis is because it was the start of my production career, right? Um, People like Genesis and 10cc and everyone else would never have happened had it not been for Tony Hall giving me advice and me being able to put this advice to all the people I then got involved in who would have gone nowhere. Groups, little tiny groups like ABBA, would never have seen the light of day had it not been for Tony Hall giving me that advice as a kid. Anyway, one of the tracks, he said, do you know what? This isn't bad. I think you could probably have a hit with it. Who would you like to produce you? And I said, well, I've got three producers I really like. Andrew Lou Goldham with the
Yeah,
Rolling Stones,
yeah,
Mickey
yes.
Most, who does, but a lot of things, and whoever it is who produces the Zombies, because I
Yeah.
think their records are fantastic. And Tony said, right, well, I'm not sending you to Andrew or Mickey because without me saying anything bad about them, you'll never get paid any money.
Okay.
And he said, you're an honest, decent young man. I want to send you to the producers of the Zombies, who are Ken Jones and Joe Roncaroni, who are honest, decent, honourable men who will not rip you off. So I went and saw Ken and Joe, in fact, only Joe to start with, who was immediately interested in me more than the song, I thought. And they were obviously honest. They had a young secretary who was 16, I think I was 18 or whatever, called Carol, who became not only then my secretary all through my life, remained a dear close personal friend, although she's now retired. She virtually ran ABBA for all their career.
Oh,
Anyway, so I went and saw them, played them my songs. They said, well, okay, there's a couple here we could do. Go away and write a B-side for it. We'll book the session. I went back to Cambridge and I wrote about half a dozen songs as the B-side, all of which were crap. Who cares on a B-side as long as you get the royalties as a writer and all
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And I was then strolling around the streets, having done that, and thought I was ready to send them off, record them, and send them off to Ken and Joe. And I suddenly came across this thought. I thought, and I remembered what Dick James and Brian had said to me. Your songs are okay, but they sound like everybody else's songs, like Buddy Holly and everyone else. You should try and make them somehow sound different. And a lot of my idols at the time were American songwriters or Canadian songwriters. Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, especially Bob Dylan, who I thought was a genius. P.F. Sloan, who wrote
Yes,
all those protest songs, remember, like The Eve of Destruction. And
yes,
I thought, hey, you know what? I want to write a song in which the lyrics rhyme moon and June, but
yeah,
that nobody will notice that because the lyric will be so meaningful in inverted commas. And that's when I wrote Everyone's Gone to the Moon. And it then was recorded at the session with Ken and Joe. They loved it. Ken was totally responsible for slowing it down, putting it into a waltz tempo, recording my voice once with and once without echo, so it sounded sort of, vaguely sort of spiritual, and
yes.
put it out. And the result was it sold 9 million copies around the
Right,
world, went to
right.
#1 everywhere. Although, interestingly enough, in America, it was #1 everywhere, but all at different times. So I think it started in LA and was a number one in LA. But by the time it had dropped in LA, it had gone to number one in New York. And funny enough, I had lunch with my friend Paul Gambaccini. He's a disc jockey from America, and he grew up in America. And he sent me a link with in the 90, I think in 65, might have been 66, there was a blackout in New York where all the electricity went dead. And on a station called WMCA, which was the big station in New York at the time, there was a DJ called, I think, Dandy Dan, someone or other, and he was playing my record when the power cut came, and
Oh.
they have a tape of it going and getting slower and
Yeah,
slower.
when they
And
told you they wanted to slow it down, they didn't mean
no,
that much. Not that
well,
much.
that's it. So that's it. And I mean, you'll find it on YouTube where
Yeah.
there are 94 billion streams of the
Oh
bloody
yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But it's quite funny that I became a part of history for that silly reason.
That's well, it was one of the songs carried on the Apollo 11 mission, moon mission.
It
They
was
took that song
indeed.
with they took that
It
song.
was Yeah, it was Michael Collins's choice. The
Yeah.
only problem being that Michael actually never landed on the moon. But yes, the song did land on the moon, but Neil Armstrong never played it, which annoyed me. I was watching on the screen as he was landing on the moon saying, "One giant step for mankind," and I was going, "Don't talk all that truism shit, you cunt. Play my fucking record."
play, play your song. Right. Get to the song. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
think of the royalties, you know.
That's right. That's
I wanted him to
oh
play my song. And, um,
yes.
it was a great time, but Decca means a lot to me because I then got really close friends with Sir Edward Lewis, who was the owner and founder of Decca Records. And but
Yeah.
the reason for that was when my record became a huge hit, he found out that I was still at that time in my first year at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he had been. So he
Yes.
sent me a message, could I please go in and see him, which I did. And we got on like a house on fire. I mean, he became
Yeah.
almost like a father figure to me.
Yes.
And
Well,
we went on all the way through. And a couple of times I ran Decca for him and
yeah.
got loads of extra hits, you know. Well, I did it as a favor. I never took any money for it, which nobody could believe
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
He paid my expenses like hotels and airfares and everything else when I was doing things like flying to LA to meet with Phil Spector, which by the way I had to do because we'd re-released a lot of his early hits, and then we discovered that the contract had run out 6 months earlier. So I had to fly out to ask him if he could give us a free extension of the contract, which he delightedly did because he was so happy that the record
Yeah.
was so big in England. Uh,
Yes.
but yes,
Yes.
all my so first class airfare and all the rest of it. I got quite used to expensive travel. I had 369 flights on Concorde in my life,
Oh,
and
did you?
I'd almost never paid for any one of
Yeah.
them. When Sir Edward Lewis was dying some years later, he said to me, "I want to give you the Decca Record Company," which was at the time worth 85 million pounds, which was quite a lot of money even then, and all that.
Yeah.
And he said, "Under the one thing that you will run it for the rest of your life." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Sir Edward, I can't do that. I can't accept it." And he said, "You're mad. Why not?" I said, "I really hated running a record company because, as you know, I ran UK Records, which was
Yeah.
unbelievably successful for years. At one point, we had three in the top five of the chart and a staff of four people. I mean, you can't imagine what this did to the major corporations who now run the music industry and have ruined the fucking thing, by the way.
Yes.
Mind you, you're partly responsible, and I'll tell you about that later. But
Okay.
but again, and so and I said no, I wouldn't, couldn't do it. And he said, "But come on, Jonathan, all you need to do is promise me you'll do it, and then when I die, do it for a year or two, and then break your promise and sell it." And I said,
Oh.
you know me, Sir Edward, that isn't me. You
Yeah,
know, my honesty and my integrity and
yeah,
my friendship with him
right.
is a million times more important than the pathetic 85 million. What do I do with 85 million quid anyway? I
Right.
don't do drugs, so I wouldn't snort
Yeah.
it up my nose.
Well,
I don't
well,
smoke cigarettes,
you
be
could,
they Capstan or
right.
players, as my mum were. I don't hardly drink, you know.
Yeah.
I live in a lovely house in the middle of London. I drive a lovely old Rolls-Royce car, which everybody adores. I have a very nice, comfortable life. I fly everywhere first class, stay in the best hotels, eat in the best restaurants. I don't need 85 fucking million quid.
Yeah. Well, you could send me some, you know, I mean,
Well, if you
I
send me
wouldn't,
your vinyl, I'll
I
send you
wouldn't,
the money.
yeah, I wouldn't turn it down. I wouldn't say no, you know. Well, it's Good News Week did well, credited to Hedgehoppers Anonymous. Where did the name come from? I have to know.
Yes, well, it's Good News Week
Yeah.
was should have been my follow-up to Everyone's Gone to the Moon. But luckily, as I said, I had two really great partners, Ken and Joe, and both of them said this is a smash as well. And I said, yeah, but I don't really want to be a singer. I want to be a producer, and I would prefer to produce this. And they said, fine, great. A, you make much more money, but B, that was the artistic, creative area I'm always much more interested in. I'm not even a very good singer. I'm quite an imaginative singer, and I can do funny things with my voice, like ooga jugga, ooga ooga, and come up
Yes,
with
yes,
ideas, you know. But
yeah.
I'm much more a producer, and somebody went, so they said fine. So I'm up at Cambridge, desperate with this song that I want to do with someone else. I'm walking past a place called the Corn Exchange, which is a big hall in Cambridge where they did gigs, groups. And I heard this group singing and walked in. I think there were more people on stage in the group than there were in the audience, actually. But the lead singer sounded quite good. And after they'd finished their bit, I went up to them and I said, look, I've got this song and I'm producing records. Would you be interested in doing it? And they said, well, we're all full time working in the RAF, the Royal Air Force,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Which was right near Cambridge. But and that's why they called themselves hedgehoppers, because that's something apparently that planes do, right?
Oh, okay, okay.
And so they said, but you know, it's we could do this. It only take us a day or so. And I'd already said, by the way, you won't be playing on it or singing on it, apart from the lead singer who just got to copy what I do. They said, yeah, no problem, great fun. So I said, okay, but I can't call you the Hedgehoppers because it's a stupid name. So do you mind if I call you Hedgehoppers Anonymous? And they said, no, that's fine. Not going anywhere anyway. And that's what we did. And I produced my first production even before Genesis. And I wrote the arrangement with dear Arthur Greenslade, who was my arranger at the time. And I told them all the bits, went na na na, all the strings do this, which is how I made records ever since. I can't write or read music, but I would do things like say to Johnny Arthey, ooga jugga, ooga ooga, by male voices. And he went, are you fucking mad? And I went, no, 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 it'll work, it'll work. And
Yes,
indeed it did. I
it
remember
did.
when I did that track, I had my bass player on that session was a man called Herbie Flowers, who was a
Oh,
great bass session
yes,
bass player. My
yes.
drummer was my drummer was Clem Catini, who is still with us, I'm glad to say, and who very sweetly had lunch a few years ago, and he said, all us British session musicians thought you were the greatest record producer in the world. And
Yeah.
I said, Clem, you worked as the Tornadoes with Joe Meek. Joe Meek
Yes.
was a genius.
Yes.
Compared to me, he had more talent in his little finger than I had in my entire career. And
Yes.
Clem said, yeah, but Joe was a cunt. And I said, yeah, you might be right. And I'm a very nice person. But even so, he was a far better record producer than I was. Anyway, and so Herbie Flowers, who was on the session, always used to do the rhythm tracks in the morning, then the
Yes.
strings and the brass and everything in the afternoon, put the
Yes.
vocals on in the evening, and then mix it overnight. So when I left the studio at 5 o'clock in the morning, I had then four mixes all mixed down. Funny enough, that session was one of the biggest sessions I ever had. I think I had four of my five tracks all turned into giant hits, which
Yes.
was unbelievable, when you think about it.
Right.
But Herbie loved it, the idea of it so much. He insisted on staying all the way through in the control room, all the way through the mixes, so that he could hear how the thing finally ended up.
How it ended.
And that was my secret as a record producer, in that everyone involved in the whole thing had such a great time doing it, and it came through on the grooves.
Yes, you can hear it in the final product.
Yes,
Exactly. And I love the strings, like you mentioned, the addition of the strings. And you
yes.
have a real sense of melody, another thing
Yeah.
about your songs.
Well,
Great,
I'm
great
not.
melody.
I'm not. I personally think everyone's gone to the moon. The
Yeah.
melody is exactly the same as three old ladies got stuck in the lavatory. Everyone's gone to the moon.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe you should have named it that.
Yeah, I'm better with lyrics than I am with melodies, in my
Well,
opinion, and others will vouch for that. I almost wrote with Elton John. Remember Reg Dwight, silly
yes.
Queen, silly bald Queen, and I almost wrote with him because he's good on melodies, where I'm better on lyrics. And Andrew Lloyd Webber once asked me if I'd write the lyrics for one of his projects after he'd split with Tim Rice. And
Yes.
I said, yeah, okay, let me know about it. And he said, well, it's all about trains. And I said, thank you very much, Andrew. I'll give you a call later. And of course, it became Starlight Express, which became
Yeah.
enormous. And I think he got
Yes.
Richard someone to write the lyric when I turned him down.
You turned him down. Well,
Yes,
tell the story of
I,
Genesis. Oh, I was
the
going to say,
story of Genesis.
yeah, the story of
Genesis is,
Genesis.
well, it's quite simple. I was down visiting my old school, Charterhouse, a couple of years after I left, by which time I'd become the number one pop star in Britain, which was an odd thing in the middle 60s. And this boy came up to me with a demo tape and said, "This is my friend's group, can you listen to it?" Driving back in the car, I did something which is unheard of in this day and age, and even then, I put the cassette in my car to listen to it, and I came to the conclusion that the guy had a fantastic voice.
Yes.
The
Yes.
songs were okay, nothing special, but the boy who was singing had a great voice. So I then called the name on the tape, and they said yes, and the boy was in the same house. We have separate houses in our schools in England, and he was in one of our house. Can I speak to him? He said yes. So he put in this guy on the phone. It was this kid called Peter Gabriel, and I said, "Well, I have to say I love your voice, and I really like the sound on the tape. I would be interested in just in doing a session with you." He said, "I can't believe it. This is the most exciting thing I've ever known." So I said, right, well, you need a name. So that's why I'll give you the name Genesis at the start of my production career. And they came up to London. I routined them with their songs. We recorded three or four songs. I decided what the single would be. I decided I really liked his voice especially, but got on well with them anyway, that I'd make an album. So during the school holidays, they came up to London to Regent Sound B Studios there, and I recorded the album with them, and they learnt things. I mean, Peter learned to play the flute slightly to do things, and we had as my engineer another old Charterhouse boy, old Carthusian we call him, called Tom Allam, who went on to be a good engineer and as a producer also discovered and produced a band called Judas Priest, who went on to
Oh,
be
okay.
quite big.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of Genesis, and that's how it
Yeah.
all started.
Well, I wanted to mention some of the tracks that I like, appreciate. You produced the first three singles and the album from Genesis to Revelation.
Yes.
I still really like Image Blown Out.
Yes, that's one of the better ones. Have you
Yes.
heard the remixes? Because we lost the multi-tracks until a
Mhm.
few years ago when we found them again. And I
Uh,
remixed a lot of them, including that track, which actually sound very good. They don't have the strings and the brass on them mostly, but they have other mixes and other tracks, and I love that. My other
Yeah.
favourites are the Silent Sun, obviously, and
Oh yes.
where the sour turns to sweet, which I loved
Yes.
as well. But
Yes.
yes,
That was that image blown out kind of has like a nice summery kind of feel to it. I like that.
yes,
And
and the
and then
Serpent, which is great. Which other
yes,
ones do you like?
I like a One-Eyed Hound,
Yes,
the B side of A Winter's Tale originally,
yes,
the B side.
yes, I
I
remember
like
it well.
I like that one. And then one of my favorites, In Hiding, which was the
Ah,
B side of Where the Sour Turns to Sweet
yes,
originally too. Yeah, In
yes.
Hiding is one of my favorites. Yes.
Now,
Was it?
that may be the one. I can't remember which was the one. Did a mix of just Peter a cappella,
Yeah.
and it's fabulous. And I really recommend you getting up. We've now sold our rights to that first album to Cherry Red Records, who are about to repackage it and put it out again, actually.
Oh, okay. I
And
have the
that
earlier.
will that'll
I have
have
an
all the
earlier.
mixes.
I
Yeah.
have an earlier release on CD, but I love. You mentioned the Silent Sun. I love the Mellotron on Fireside Song. Remember that one?
Yes, and that was in the early days, and I did use a lot of other. I used Arthur Greenslade to do strings and brass and other things. The main reason was they were very young, these kids. They were just 16 or 17. They weren't very good on their instruments, so they kept going out of tune. They couldn't afford expensive instruments at that stage. So I then gave them an album which they say it's not true was the Bee Gees, right? I was very keen on the Bee Gees at the time. In fact, I was their number one champion, even at the same
Oh,
stage as Robert Stigwood picked up on them. But the album I gave them was Crosby, Stills and Young, Stills, Nash
okay.
and Young, right? And I said, do the songs acoustically because I knew then that they would hear if they made any mistakes.
Right.
And that also, it didn't matter that their guitars were cheap guitars because we could get the right sound in the studio from them, but they would hear if they were going out of tune. And that
Oh,
was why we recorded that in that way. And then I put the strings and brass on afterwards.
yes, yes. Nice touches to that, and a couple of more tracks. That album is really quality. I mean, all the way through. Am I Very Wrong? Another one that I really like, and then
Yeah.
In the Wilderness, another one.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad you like all those. The album didn't do much, obviously, then, although it's done miles better since as the years have gone by. And I still think it was a really terrific album, way ahead of its time,
Yes. Yes.
especially because it showed Peter's fantastic voice,
Yes,
which
it
we
did.
now all know, but that really came through. So I'm very proud of that album.
Yeah.
The problem is, as with so much in my life, I tend to be way ahead of the
Yes.
world. So it was when I then persuaded a friend of mine who was a football journalist on a paper called the Daily Sketch to take the boys over because I like starting things off, but I then lose interest when it comes to things like shipping equipment to Scandinavia. I go, no, this isn't my. I'm not an administration person. I'm an
Right.
ideas and a creative person. I started Genesis off, and then I said, Tony Stratton Smith was the guy's name, and he
Okay.
had an office in the basement of the building I had my office in, and he was a really good friend from the clubs and everything. And I'd actually produced a little group of his called the Coobers in the 60s.
Oh
Again,
yeah.
back, yeah, the tracks never went anywhere. they One of the drummer in the Coopers went on to play in Yes for a while, and they
Yeah.
became quite big. But anyway, so I said to Tony, please take them over. He said, oh, I don't know. It's not my sort of thing, really. I said, oh, no, please. And anyway, I said, you're the only person who I know who is honest and straight and won't rip them off. And he of course wasn't straight sexually, as
Yes.
neither was I. but I knew full well he wouldn't abuse them in that way either, because he
Yeah.
was a decent, honest man, right? And if they said no, he would accept it. But I knew financially and on all those levels he'd be decent. Anyway, he took them on, and I remember I was in Italy, and I heard one of the tracks on the album, from the album, and I was so excited. I called Peter up and said, "You'll never believe this! A radio station in Italy is playing your track," and he was all really excited as well. But
Yes.
and about a couple of years later, Tony called me up and he said, "I hate you," and I said, "Why?" And he said, well, I decided I had to renew their contract, and they were contracted to his record label, which was a silly little label called Charisma. And
Yes.
he said, I decided it just wasn't fair to sign them to my own label as their manager because I had to negotiate with myself and I would then rip them off. And I remembered my promise to you that I would never rip them off. So I've taken on this other guy, a man called Tony Smith, funnily enough, and he seems very good. And I thought, well, he can do the management and negotiate with me as a label. And he said, he's really fucked me over. He's done a deal that I really can't afford. And it's all because of you and you're responsible. And I said, Tony, I'll buy you lunch. And when you get to heaven, you'll find you've got a blessing there.
Right. I like that. Oh, well said. I like that. Well, in 72, you founded UK Records.
I did
Uh,
indeed.
and the first hit was Seaside Shuffle by Terry Dactyl and the Dinosaurs, which
Yeah.
is an alias for Brett Marvin and the Thunderbolts. Yeah.
And even for Jonah Louie, who's gone on to have many hits since.
Yes. Yes. And that's another, unique name, right there. First Class was also on the label, the band with Beach Baby. They
Yeah,
recorded.
first class. And again, first class named by me because I
You
was always
did
on the plane. Yeah, I named them the
Genesis
first. Yes,
Genesis First Class. You're
the
there at the
first
beginning.
class,
Yeah.
10cc, and all
Yeah.
the rest of them. They're
Did
all
did you?
named by me.
Oh, you named 10cc as well.
All
Okay.
of them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't make any money from naming any of them. But yes, no, I named them all. There's a rumor around with 10cc, which they're always after about. I had lunch with Graham Gouldman, who is now 10cc on his own, and has
Yes.
just been touring America, by the way, with great reaction from everybody. And he and I had lunch because one of the nice things about my career is we've all remained friends through
Yes.
all these years, even
Yes.
if we've had fallings out financially and so on, we've all remained friends. And what I also have to say is they've all remained pretty decent human beings. They've none of them got into drugs or died early or done drink or anything else. They
Yes.
all tend to survive. I mean, the first class is actually a friend of mine called John Carter. I speak to him quite often.
Oh yeah.
He's, yeah.
I interviewed John
Well, John's
probably three years ago now.
John
Yeah.
and his wife, terribly
Right. Right.
talented people. I'm
Right.
very fond of them both. And
Yeah.
Tony Burrows, who sang on Beach Baby and all the rest, and all
Yes.
these people. And I've remained close to them all. They're all supporters of mine.
Speaking of 10cc, one of my favorite bands of all time. They had the two camps really. Lowell Cream, Kevin Godley would do the more quirky kind of songs, and then Graham and
Eric,
yeah, and
Eric,
Eric would do the more ballads and things like
no,
that.
no, you're wrong about that.
Uh-huh.
There was a fifth member of 10cc, which was me.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah, and not only did I name them, but part of my influence was bringing all four of those ingredients together. So
Yes.
yes, they did have when they split up, which happened fairly early on, as you know. When they split up, they had a few hits as well separately, but they
Separately.
never had that magic that they had when all four were working together. And it
Right.
wasn't just all four of them, it was the five of us because I would listen to the tracks, go to the studio, suggest, as I did with Genesis, that solo's too long. You should have that verse in here instead of there, and they all quite wanted to get my approval and to get my, and I would be unbelievably rude if something didn't work and all that. And they loved that because most artists don't get that from, I would say the words are A&R, as I was technically A&R for it. But I was always a very hands-on A&R. It was why actually it wasn't right for me to keep producing Genesis because they were a band that actually were developing their own creative way, and they no longer, after the first album, needed my input and me to say to them, there's too much bass there, the piano riff is wrong. Although I did say, you need a new drummer because their drummers were always crap. Um,
Yeah.
and so I did do that. But generally, after their initial starting them off stage, they didn't really need me anymore. And that's why I've never taken a penny from them of their future career and all their gigs and everything else when they've made millions and millions. And many times people have said to me, even just for coming up with their name, you deserve half a percentage or something. And I went, no, I didn't break them. If I'd broken them, as actually I did with 10cc, which is why I do still earn money from 10cc, especially from one of the tracks they recorded under my aegis, but after they technically left me, but I was on an override from all their future ones. And I have to say, I make more money now from I'm Not in Love, one
Oh,
song by 10cc, than
yeah.
everything else by 10cc, Genesis, everyone put together.
Is that right? The royalties and that
The
coming, yeah.
royalties just flooded. Obviously,
Oh,
the royalties flooded from Everyone's Gone to the Moon because
yes.
I mean, I remember recently I couldn't work out why I suddenly got a huge
Right.
several checks for being the writer of that until I
Right.
realised it was on the new. It was she had just died, and it was on the Doris Day album that they
Oh,
put out.
yeah. I heard that. I don't remember who it was that said that, but they said the way to make tons of money in the music industry is have one huge hit and then just rake in the royalties from that.
It
Don't
is.
have to.
It is. Yes, it's sort of one's pension basically.
Yes, pension. Yeah. Well, prior
But
to,
you see, but the
go ahead.
problem is, and this brings me back to something I mentioned earlier, why you're partly to blame,
Oh, yeah, tell me.
right? So, do you want to hear this, or would you prefer
Yes.
if I
No,
don't
go
go
ahead.
into this?
What?
Right,
No, while you're thinking of it, go ahead. Go ahead.
right. Well, the problem is this: when I moved out of the music industry, which I didn't really want to do, but I was pushed out, what the music industry lost was somebody who, and I tend to underplay myself on this, which you find rather odd to hear, because I do have the ego the size of the Empire State Building. But the reality is, I have really, really good ears and instincts about talent and music. And very few people had that, including everybody in the current music industry. That was why, when I kept going on and on and on about I get knocked down, but I get up again, I couldn't find one person who agreed with me. And I actually had to persuade two people, Rupert Perry, who was the chairman of EMI in Europe at the time, and Monty Lippman, who's gone on to be a great executive in America, Universal. I had to almost persuade them to take this track on. I said, this is going to be a smash. It's brilliant. But people like me don't exist in that music industry anymore. Likewise, my idea, which was get it played in sports stadiums. Every time somebody gets knocked down playing American football, get the DJ to play, I get knocked down, but I get up again. And that's what happened. And it was 16 million records, right? The same happened to me later on with a song called Who Let the Dogs Out? That I
Yeah.
did the original version of and all the rest. That was the same kind of thing. And again, I said, break it in sports stadium when defense comes in or the attack come in. Who let that dog? And that's how it broke. I actually remember where. New Orleans. A friend of
New
mine was
Orleans.
the disc jockey in the stadium in New Orleans. Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, I remember when I was consultant to my dear friend Dick Asher over at Polygram, and he wanted to drop this group that weren't doing anything called Bon Jovi. And I said, let them release one last record, and actually gave him a song written by Mutt Langer that could be a hit. And he listened, he said, you know what? I have faith in you, Jonathan. I will let them record a last album. And I said, yeah, but in that case, they have to co-write with someone because they're not writing hits yet. So Dick said, well, who do you suggest? I said, well, top of the line for me is Diane Warren. She's brilliant. She was also doing far too much at the time with foreign and everyone else. She couldn't do it. So I said, second in line for me was Michael Bolton, because although Michael Bolton was a singer, he was a great writer. And at that point, he was just actually writing for himself. He hadn't even put any records out as a singer. So I said, okay, third choice, Desmond Child. He's up and coming out on the coast. So Dick sent John and Richie out to meet, to spend months with Desmond Child. And that's when they wrote Living on a Prayer and You Give Love a Bad Name, came back, put out a thing. Bon Jovi became huge. Incidentally, another of the nicest people you could ever hope to meet in your life, he and his wife, who I've known for some way back then. But it's things like that that I could do. At that point, I was just a consultant because I was a very good friend of Dick's and had been a consultant his at Sony, where amongst other things, all his A&R staff had told him he should drop this artist who was doing very well but was terribly expensive, so they could use the budget for their crappy artists who weren't doing anything. And I
Yeah.
said, no, Dick, I have to tell you, Michael Jackson will be huge. And Mick said, I go with you, Jonathan. This was as a consultant, and said to Michael Jackson, okay, you've got a deal. Next thing comes out, the Thriller album. End of
Yeah.
story.
Right. At that point, you're right. And then it just took off from there. Yeah. Right, right, right. Well, see, I like hearing all this, behind the scenes, things that were going on that maybe a lot of the viewers will enjoy it too, that they weren't aware of. Graham Goldman would be a great interview. I don't know if he's
Oh, I'm
doing
sure
those.
he'd do it. I'm
Yeah.
sure he'd do it. I know because he got together with Bob Lefsetz. You know Bob Lefsetz, who does the Lefsetz thing? Oh, you should subscribe to him. He's very good, Bob. And I
Okay.
know Graham was in touch with him, and he'd be delighted to do it. I'm sure you just get in touch with him, and I'm sure you'll find he'd be extremely
Yes,
amenable. And of
that would
course,
be.
I mean, one of the things, have you seen the ABBA Voyage show? You probably haven't, I don't
No,
suspect.
no.
It is absolutely brilliant. It's when they've recreated all the AI images and all that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's sensational. And after I went to it, and I came out thinking, this is fucking brilliant. This is the future. Because there you have ABBA making great music for generations long after they're all dead.
Yeah.
They can put this show on, which had a live element with a band doing a couple of their songs and all that, but with the huge things on screen. Anyway, I said, look, do you know what? This is brilliant for both Genesis and 10cc because both of them have got huge amounts of stuff that isn't just Genesis or 10cc. So
Right.
you've got on the Genesis thing, you'd have Mike and the Mechanics as well as Peter's solo stuff and all the rest.
That's right. That's right.
And and that's why the only one of 10cc, they don't speak to each other, by the way, the four of them now at all. And the only one who agreed with me and thought we must do it was Graham. And when we
Okay.
had lunch, I said, "You have to do this. I won't make anything from it, but it'll be great for that." Because I said, Graham especially has this brilliant back catalogue of Yardbird songs and Herman's
Oh
Hermits,
yeah,
and,
the songs
all
he
the
wrote. The song.
the
Right.
songs he wrote were fantastic. And
Right.
then some of the ones he made better off with Wax and all those other ones,
Yes.
Andrew
Yes.
Gold and all
Andrew
these.
Gold. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Eric Stewart had many again with Stevie Wonder and what's the guy who did
Yeah.
Neil? Neil made those old hits. Guy who wrote this Frank Sinatra hit.
Uh,
Neil Sedaka.
Neil
Yes, it was.
Sedaka. Yes,
It
Neil.
wasn't. He didn't write it. It was another one. But then,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, and then
Eric worked with Neil
yeah,
and also
and
with
then
McCartney and all the
right,
rest of it.
and even
And
and before 10cc, Eric with the mind
all of
benders.
that, Hot
Yeah,
Legs, which
yeah,
was the reason I got
right,
onto him in the first place.
right.
So all of
Neanderthal man.
those
Yeah,
would be in a voyage type show. Fantastic.
that
Anyway,
was.
because the 10cc boys don't speak to each other, they all speak to me, by the way, but they're no longer speaking to each other. That's never going to happen. And the
Right.
Genesis thing again, well, it just takes too much, I think. But again, that was my suggestion to Graham, and he was really well up for it. He enjoys touring. He's touring as 10cc. The
Yes,
other boys tried to stop him doing it. I said, hang on,
yes,
I came up with a name. I give him full permission and
yes.
you full permission. You can all do whatever you like. So that
Right.
rather scuppered that and made Graham very grateful.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I wanted to mention from the two 10cc albums that were on UK. Of course, the first one has Donna, The Dean and I, Rubber Bullets. But I think my favorite, Fresh Air for My Mama. You remember
well,
that track?
I love that. It was a great
Yeah.
track. But
Yeah.
also, I have to say, I think probably the best track of them all. My favorite was Johnny Don't Do It, which never did a thing. But
Yeah.
I think also on that first album, the Wall Street Shuffle.
I think that's on the second one. I think that's on sheet music. Isn't it Wall Street Shuffle? I think it's on
You
sheet
might,
music.
you might
Yeah.
be right. Don't forget,
Yeah.
I am now 80 and
That's all right.
senile.
I think so. But I like the B side of the instrumental Gizmo My Way. I like that.
Yes.
Yes, that's a nice one. Yeah.
Were you not keen on 4% of something? Which was, you can guess why that was written. That was for one
Right.
particular person, which is a matter of interest.
Okay.
And that is the override I get on all their future stuff.
Okay.
I earn 4%
Yeah.
of that.
But I think my favorite off of sheet music is Old Wild Men. I
Oh,
like that
that's
one.
brilliant.
Isn't that a
That would
brilliant?
have, yeah, that would have been a hit in its own right, I've often thought.
I think so too. I think so too. Kind of overshadowed by the other hits. And then
Yes.
also Bay City Rollers signed to the label. Uh, what
Well,
was the
no,
story?
no,
What
they
happened
didn't.
there?
Yeah, they didn't sign to the label. I produced them for Bell Records two
Oh,
years before I started the label, and they wanted to move from Bell onto my label, and I said no, I couldn't be bothered because, as you say, I like starting things off. My whole thinking with them was, which they weren't on the first record, Keep On Dancing, which was a cover of the Gentry's American record, and
yes.
that was I sang everything, session musicians on it, everything. And my thinking was that it's like a BTS or One Direction.
Yeah.
They were young kids, they had a big following. I would be in Clover making crap records for them for the next 10 years, collecting my royalty and not worrying.
Yeah.
However, my second and third releases by the Basic Rollers died on their arses. I would so, and then they went to several producers, none of which worked either, until they finally went to two friends of mine, Bill Martin and Phil Coulter, who then produced Saturday and all that. And I always remember with that, I was in New York and Clive Davis had just formed Arista Records, which had bought Bell Records. And Clive and I had breakfast one day, and he said, "These Bay City Rollers, do you think they could be a hit in America?" And I said, "Well, I got to tell you, Clive, my head says not in a million years, and my heart says yes." And he
Uh,
said, "Okay, I'll go with your heart. This one, because he normally
yeah.
went with my head. He said, this one, I'll go with your heart, and the
Yeah.
rest is history."
Yes. For them, it sure was. It sure was. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of your hits from the 70s credited to various pseudonyms. Uh, Johnny Reggae by the Piglets.
Yes. Well, that was just the whole thing. The reggae skinhead thing was happening. I came out. I met this kid at a dance called. His girlfriend introduced me and said, "We call him Johnny Reggae." I said, "That's a great name. Do you mind if I use it and write a song around it?" He said, "No, that's fine." So in the car. driving back to town, I wrote the entire song and then recorded it at the same session where I did Hooked on a Feeling, Ooga Jagga, Ooga
Yeah.
Ooga. They were two ones of the same session, in which three of them were huge hits in the end. And that was it. And put it out. I gave it to Bell Records at the time. I hadn't started UK by then, and it exploded and became enormous and sold all around the world. I remember it was a huge hit in Germany and places where you think I can't understand why, but that did happen.
Yes. Well, that Ooga Chaka Ooga Ooga. Yeah. What a stroke of genius there. Uh, because Blue Suede, Swede, not Suede, Blue Swede would take it to number one in '74. Yeah.
Yes, and that was quite amusing. Two things on that. Um, my version came out in America through London Records at the time with UK Records, and they didn't do anything with it. And then I get this call from Sweden with this guy called Bjorn Skiffs, and he said, "Do you mind if we cover that your version of the record?" And I said, "No, it's not my song, written by Mark James." I said, I would love to see it be a hit in Sweden, which would sell 20,000 copies. It didn't mean a lot. And he said, "Oh, thank you very much." And they did their version, which was really no different to mine. And then a few months later, and it was a hit in Sweden. I thought, well done, congratulations. I didn't make a penny from it, but I was delighted. Then I get a call from a guy called Al Curry. Al Curry, all these people were friends of mine, and they were all behind the scenes because right from the beginning, with Tony Hall and Ken and Joe and so on, my people were the people behind the scenes. I never really cared much about artists. Most artists are brain dead and cunts. So, so why bother to spend any time with them? But I really liked the people behind the scenes. They were much more interesting. So I get this call from Al Curry, who was then head of promotion at Capitol Records. He said, "We've got this record from Sweden, from our licensee in Sweden, and I always thought your record should have been enormous, and it never was. I'm going to put this out, and I think I could break it. Would you mind? Because if you really don't want me to do it, I won't do it." And I said, "This proves that the people behind the scenes in the music industry are not all shits," which was the rumor everyone went out. And I go, "Most people, I think, are really good, decent people." And I
Right.
said, "Of course you can do it. Good luck to you. And if it's a huge hit, I'll be delighted." And of
Yeah.
course, it came out and went to number one and sat there for weeks. So that was part one of the story. Part two of the story is another friend of mine from my early 60 days was a DJ called Casey Kasem. Do you remember him?
Oh
Right.
yes. Oh yeah.
He was on a station in Los Angeles called KRLA in the 60s, and I'd done an interview with him and we became friends when Everyone's Gone to the Moon was a hit. Anyway, by this point, the early 70s, he was doing a really successful syndicated top 40 show that went on radio to almost every radio station in the States. And every time he played the Blue Swede record or the Blue Swede record, he said, "I'm not going to play this because the original was by Jonathan King and it's far better." And he played my version. Right,
Ah,
even when it was number one on the US charts, which I think
yeah.
was for 6 or 7 weeks, every week he did the same
Uh,
thing. I mean, can you imagine anything more honorable and nice and kind and decent? And
right.
that sort of thing is why I loved the music industry and have had a very, very happy life with really good, nice people in my life. And that sort of personifies exactly my feelings on it.
Yes, there are lots of good people in the business. You're right.
Oh,
There are. Unfortunately, there are a few bad apples as well.
As,
So,
as in every walk of life.
right, right. Very true. Very well. B.J. Thomas had a hit with it, country version, more country, earlier
His
on.
that was the first one, and that's the version I
Yeah.
heard, and
Yes.
I thought this is a hit song,
Yeah.
but it's not done the way "I am hooked on a feeling," bow, bow,
Yeah.
bow, bow,
It
bow. And I
was
went, no, no,
country.
no, no, no.
Yeah.
I can do it in a much poppier reggae type way, and
Yeah.
my thinking was, I didn't want to use reggae the way that everybody else was doing it, which was plucking guitars and bass and all that. And I thought, how can I do it differently? And I thought, right, I'll make the intro to be a reggae rhythm, but
Uh-huh.
done differently. And how can I do that? I thought, and I actually started off by just singing what I wanted one of the instruments to do. Ooga jugga, ooga ooga. Because I used to sit with my arranger and say to him, right, it starts off with, I don't know, the piano player going ooga gaga, ooga ooga ooga, whatever. And then when I listened to the demo tapes I was made to play to my arrangers, and I thought, actually, that's quite clever. It works quite well. And so that's why I did it. And in doing the session, obviously, since it began before the rhythm came in, I
Yeah.
had to do Ooga Jagga Ooga Ooga. That's why Herbie Flowers got hooked on it when he
Yeah.
heard me doing it and realized I was actually going to use 3 or 4 session singers to do that on my record because
Yeah.
I don't wanted the contrast for my reedy little voice singing the lead vocal to be different. So that
Yeah.
was how that came about, and it all
Yeah.
worked very well. To this day, I'm very happy with it.
Yeah. What pipes that singer from Blue Sweet had, that man, he carried that song. That the voice, the vocals on I don't know his name. I don't remember his name, but great
What on the
vocal.
Blue Suede one?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was Bjorn Skiffs, I
Oh,
think.
that's who that.
Yeah.
Well, Loop de Love by Shag.
Yes, another one of my masterpieces.
And then a cover of Sugar Sugar by
Yep.
Saccharin. Now I
Yes,
like
I
that. Saccharin, sugar substitute, right?
That's it. Many people never got the joke. I
Oh, they
had
didn't.
loads and loads of fan mail for this progressive heavy metal group called Saccharino, and some people realise the whole thing is a joke. But there was a serious point in that. I made an album called Bubble Rock is Here to Stay that had lots of these sort of things in it,
Yeah,
including my version of Satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction, which Mick Jagger to this day says is the second best version of that song, right?
yeah. Another cover, Una Paloma Blanca, and that was credited to you. To you, you used your name on that one. Yeah,
That's the track that Doug Morris and Dick Vanderbilt picked up for Big Tree in America and were going to turn into a massive #1 record. And another one of my friends, Mo Austin, was the head of Warner's at the time, and he had the original by George Baker that was from Holland.
yeah,
And,
yes, yes,
and he pushed that and therefore had the hit with that, only a small hit, by the way, because the George Baker version I don't think was as good as mine. With most of my covers, I quite often don't think they're as good as, for example, my version of Gloria
yeah,
was not as good as the one that, again, Doug Morris persuaded Laura Branigan to do, and she did a better version, I thought, actually. So for those reasons, I didn't resent that. But I did resent the fact that Una Paloma Blanca, which I sold millions of around the world, by the way, but uh, but I thought my version was better. The main reason being is I put in, which I stole, I borrowed. Do you remember Nancy Sinatra and Lee Hazelwood? These boots are made for walking.
yes, of
And
course,
you
of
remember
course.
it's got a bass riff that goes bum 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 bum
Boom,
bum
boom,
bum
boom,
bum
boom.
bum bum.
Yes,
And
yes,
I sort of borrowed that for Una Paloma Blanca. So I had this dum 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 going on in there, which I think was a stroke of genius for that. But what can you do? Yes, that was big. That sold millions for me. I mean, as I said, it's quite odd when you think that under all my pseudonyms, I gather this comes from either ASCAP or BMI. I've
yeah.
sold 40 million records as a singer. So that ignores all the productions and the other people and so on. When you think of that, you go, hey, Taylor Swift, you think you're mainstream?
Right, right, right. Well, when and why did you relocate to New York?
Why did I what?
Relocate to New York?
Oh, I really mainly did that. I was really disappointed by the music industry when 10cc screwed me about going after I'd spent 3 years building them up, moving to another label and all that. And I thought this is really pissing me off. And I was sort of getting annoyed anyway. The music thing, I was thinking, I've done it all in music by this point, late 70s. And I had my apartment in New York, which was originally the UK Records office where my staff were based. But I was running it down, and I think the main hit we had was Beach Baby by the First Class. And yes, 10cc were doing okay. And I had the Butterfly Ball, which was one of Deep Purple's offshoot things. Remember all that stuff?
Oh,
I knew we
yes.
were doing okay, but I don't like running a record company, as I told you earlier when I turned down Sir Edward's thing. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to go and live in America. And came over to the States and cropped up a lot on various people wanted people on shows to talk about the Prince Charles wedding to Princess Diana and British things that were going on. Since I was vaguely articulate, which you may have noticed I no longer am, I can't string words together anymore, and I hardly say anything. And so I then went on this funny little station called WMCA doing things, and it was owned by a couple called Peter and, oh, I've forgotten her name now, but I was very fond of the two of them. And they said, "You're absolutely brilliant. We want you to do a regular show." And I said, "Oh, no, no, I'm not really into that." And they said, "No, please, please, please." And offered me a lot of money to do it. And I said, "Well, I might do it just for a short period of time, like a year." So they fired one of their main people, who was Sally Jesse Raphael. Do you remember
Yes, I
her?
remember her. She had a talk
Yeah.
show. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
she had a TV show as well. Lovely lady, by the way, really nice lady. Anyway, they fired her and put me on. So I was in New York and I was living there and I was doing this daily radio show from 10 in the morning till midday, I think it was. And it got enormous ratings. And there was a guy on our other station, I can't remember the other WABC, called Don Imus. Do you remember him?
Oh, I do. Yes, I
Right.
do.
Well,
Yeah.
he used to do the breakfast show, and what they found was after, as his breakfast show ended, everybody switched over to me on WMCA, and it was unbelievable. The ratings went through the roof. I had a great time. I loved doing it, although I made it very clear I wasn't going to do it for more than a year. But I loved doing it when I was doing it. Um, the love of my life had joined me in New York and had got a job at Sotheby's, where he was doing great there too, and got himself a girlfriend who then became his wife, and they both lived with me and produced daughters that I'm the godfather to. And it was all very nice on that level. And then the program director on WMCA left and went somewhere. It might have been WABC, but it was somewhere very big. I think it was WABC because what he wanted was he saw Don Imus, who was the king of breakfast radio, and he wanted somebody to do the drive time afternoon radio, 4 to 7 in the afternoon. They offered me an absolute fortune to do that. And every time I said no, they doubled the offer. And it was
Oh,
just silly money. And I kept saying, no, it's not the money. I've never done anything for the money, which includes Genesis and all the rest of them. I said, no, but I just don't want to do it. So eventually, the guy, Mark, his name was, I can't remember his last name, but a lovely man, finally accepted I wasn't going to do it and went searching around and find somebody who was on overnight at a station in Washington, who he said, "Do you know what? He's nowhere near as good as you, JK, but I think he could be reasonably okay." And because these people had all become friends of mine, so they'd ask my advice. Could you listen to him and see? I thought, oh yeah, he's rather good. And so the job went to Howard Stern.
oh, okay. Oh, wow. Yeah, yeah. And that's another story there.
Can you
Yeah.
imagine? Can you imagine my life? Right. By the
Yeah.
way, coming out next month is my third volume of autobiography called 80. That's all, folks, which is the third volume. And you'll get some of these stories in there, or my previous two volumes.
Yes, yes. Bible too. Uh,
Bible 2, which was my first
anyway,
published novel.
yes, and then the Booker Prize winner from
That was the
90.
second, my
Yes.
second published novel.
Yes.
Now, and now, incidentally, all available from Amazon on print on demand if you want, or Kindle if you're into a Kindle thing. But you can also get them for almost no money at all on print on demand now. That's how Amazon now give you universal worldwide distribution.
Right, right. Well, briefly, Jonathan, back in the UK, you wrote and hosted the Brit Awards. Uh, how'd you like that? Did you enjoy doing that?
On that one, yes. By this point, I was becoming a TV superstar in Great Britain, mainly due to a show called Entertainment USA.
Okay.
And this was me back in the States, and it all started when I was doing my radio show on WMCA. And I was there, and Top of the Pops was a show I was on from almost the very beginning. I was on the very first London Top of the Pops, doing Everyone's Gone to the Moon as the highest new entry that week. So I was quite fond of this show. I had a big sort of soft spot for it, and I got a sort of regular, sort of 5 or 10 minute slot on the show about what was going on in America in the charts, playing like 30 seconds of a video or a film and rattling down and saying I love this track or I don't like that one or whatever. And out of that came this show called Entertainment USA, which was a half-hour weekly show where I went around the States to all different cities talking to people who were there. So I did this series and it was hugely successful. Went to #1 in the charts on the ratings. It was great fun to do. I included bits of hit records, trailers from some of the movies. I remember we did Back to the Future. Do you remember that one with
Oh, yes.
Michael J. Fox and all the rest of it? And it caught on like wildfire and became absolutely enormous. So when this was huge, and at one point, then I was approached if I would introduce the Brits, which was like the Grammys, but the British thing. So I did that. And I only agreed to do it if I could virtually put it together, write obviously my script, which wasn't really a script, but everything, include which records or artists I thought were worth having on, give the awards and so on. It was quite lucky that the main award for Best Male Singer the year I presented it was Peter Gabriel. And that
Oh,
was nothing to do with me or height.
yes,
It's
yeah,
actually he had I think he had that Sledgehammer record. Do you remember
yes,
that one
yeah.
with that video and all? Anyway, so that was quite nice to do. And it was a great success. It did very well. So afterwards, they started going. They thought two things. One, they could do it in a much bigger venue and make much more money from it. Money has always been the big influence on all this. And the second thing was they thought, do you know what? They could go with a much more popular host. Because although I was doing terribly well at everything, I was also quite unpopular because I used to criticize people. Like, for instance, I slagged off the Live Aid Band Aid thing, which I hated and thought sounded awful and was full of people doing bad job and all that. Well, people didn't like that at all, you know. They didn't like, they're never too keen on you criticizing charitable duties and all that. Anyway, so they used somebody else the next year. I think it was Noel Edmonds the next year, and that was all a disaster. And then they overran because, of course, the guy didn't do the writing and everything that I'd done, so he didn't know how he could shorten his speech and all that. Anyway, it all collapsed. It was a disaster. They had a couple of. I remember I was with Aha. Do you remember that strange
Yes,
Scandinavian
I
group?
do. Take on me, take on me.
Yeah, and Rick Astley. Do you remember Rick Astley and all? Anyway, so that we were all, and it all went terribly wrong. So the next year they took on, because they thought they looked quite amusing. One was very tall and one was very short. We were talking about height earlier. They took on Mick Fleetwood from Fleetwood Mac
Oh, yeah, he's really good. Yeah.
and my girlfriend at the time, who had been my girlfriend for years, was a sweet girl, but was very, very small. There was a girl called Samantha Fox, who actually
Oh,
I got her a record deal in
yeah,
America with,
yes,
years
yeah.
before and all that. Anyway, so those two were booked. And that was a disaster because they couldn't read the auto cue and everything. And it turned out to be embarrassingly disastrous. So they sort of came creeping back to me and said, please, will you take it over? We can't, you
Yeah.
know. So I said, okay, I'll take it over. But one, I don't want to host it anymore because I didn't really enjoy being a TV host. It's like being a singer on records, you know. I could do it. I was perfectly adequate at doing it. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I'm almost incapable of speaking. I'm a very shy, quiet human being. Um, but I could do the job. But it gave me no creative satisfaction to say, and that was the winner of Best Female, and now here's the best group. You know, I mean, what brain death? You know, I mean,
Yeah.
it made me appear to be like fucking Taylor Swift or fucking BTS. You know, these brain dead
Yeah.
children who are only booked for their appearance. That was
Yeah.
probably why I was booked, because as you can see, I am extremely good looking. Anyway,
That's the reason, yes.
yeah, moving right along from that. So I said, I don't want to present it. In fact, I don't want any hosts at all. And I have total charge on what records are on and all the rest of it and how it's done. And they said, yes, yes, anything, anything. Please take it over. And I said, well, there you go. So I then did take over producing it, and it again became hugely successful over the 3 years. And they begged me to keep doing it and said I could have as much money as I wanted and a firm contract for years and years and years. But by the third year, the record company bosses were really getting annoyed because beforehand they'd run it and always pushed their awful priorities on. And by the third year, they were really getting pissed off that I wouldn't book their awful priorities, one of which I particularly remember was someone who hadn't had any hits and didn't mean anything at the time, although she went on to become reasonably successful and marry a friend of mine, by the way, I think. And that was a singer called Tori Amos. Remember
Uh,
her?
yes, yes,
Right.
I do.
And
Yeah.
I said, no, I'm not putting her on. She's not any hit. She's American anyway, you know. And I remember the head of the record label, who was a dear friend of mine, he said, if you don't put her on, you will never do this show again. And I said, I don't, you can blackmail me all you like. I don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
I'm only doing this to save your bacon because the industry is collapsing, you know. And I'll book the people I want to book, as indeed I did, which every now and again were unsigned bands. I mean,
Yeah.
can you imagine how the major labels hated me
Yes.
featuring on the Brits, i.e., the Grammys, an unsigned artist, you know,
Yes.
which of
Yes.
course meant that the artist got hugely huge offers and became huge afterwards and all that. Anyway, so that for that year, I then quit at the end of it, and it was great fun, and I did it well, and it then became a sort of corporate thing, much
Yeah.
like the Grammys are.
Yeah.
And as the music industry has died down with no mass appeal artists, who in the world wants to see BTS or Taylor Swift apart from One Direction fans or whatever, you know? So the ratings have completely disappeared. Nobody
Yeah.
buys records anymore. Everybody streams records, which, as you
Streaming.
know, you earn 1 pence if you do 42 billion streams. And you go, they are killing the industry by
Yeah.
putting out records that only appeal to tiny groups of fans. But
Yes.
I mean, so I'm now 80. I'm well beyond it all. But that's what happened. That was my time as not only heading up that, but also heading up and winning Eurovision for the United Kingdom.
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned
Yeah.
Katrina, but
Yeah.
actually, I felt our better entry was the one the year before. The only problem was the girl couldn't perform at all, but the
Oh.
track was great. Ooh, ah, just a little bit. It was the biggest selling Eurovision entry around the world of all time. I think even including ABBA. It went to number 1 on the US dance charts, I remember. So even America were buying it. And I think that, to me, is the ultimate Eurovision entry.
Yeah. And it should have won. You're saying
Yes.
it should have won. All right. Well, I think we've definitely just about run out of gas here, Jonathan. I think I'm looking at my tank and it's almost on empty. So, but
Rumor
it's been,
has it your tank is almost on empty, Greg.
did, did that
Um,
pre did that precede me? Is that what happened?
yes, but briefly before you
Yeah,
go,
yeah.
let me plug my latest effort, which
Oh,
I
sure.
think is another one of those mass appeal tracks that everybody who's involved in music and serious music and everything else will think is crap, but I think could be enormous. And what we're aiming to is to get it to be the very first global Christmas Day #1. So #1 on Christmas Day in Peru, Singapore, South Africa, Peking, everywhere. And you'll find it on YouTube and everywhere else and streaming things. It's by the group is called MOMS, MOMS, which stands for Men of Mars, MORS, right? Men of Mars,
Uh-huh.
MOMS. Um, and the track is called Musk on Mars. And it's all about, it's very much it's an instant irritating earworm of a track. And the premise is, and it's the video, which you can see on YouTube and everywhere else, is great fun and reminiscent of children's television from the 1970s, deliberately low tech, the whole thing. And
Yeah.
I think that the joy of it is the premise is this: the year is 2075, 50 years' time, the earth has ceased to exist. Humanity has had to move to the only city they can live in, which is called Musk. And it's a city on Mars. And you can imagine why I say that.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
therefore, and it's not negative at all, unusually, either about Elon Musk himself or about the idea of creating life on Mars. David Bowie was an old friend of mine. Read all about him in my next book. But I think you will find it extremely catchy. It's called Musk on Mars. So I leave you with that happy thought of what JK is doing in the year 2025.
Okay, that sounds good. So viewers, be sure and check that out on YouTube. Yes, we will, and I will. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing and going back in that time machine with me. And
Greg,
it's
it's been a great pleasure.
all right, Jonathan. Well, again, it's been very enjoyable, and all the best to you. Okay,
Thank
and
you very much, Greg, and lots of love to every one of your viewers.